The courtroom fell deadly silent as 6-year-old Sophie Parker stepped through the heavy oak doors. Her trembling hand gripped the leash of Max, a battle-scarred German shepherd. Every eye followed the small girl as she approached the witness stand, her steps faltering but determined. Judge Elena Martinez leaned forward, studying the child with careful intensity. The entire case rested on Sophie's tiny shoulders. She was the only witness to a brutal crime, a crime that could put a monster away forever. But there was one devastating problem. Sophie hadn't spoken a single word in 97 days. Across the room, Victor Rhodes sat at the defense table, his face a mask of calm confidence. Sophie's fingers twitched in a subtle pattern. Only two beings noticed it, Max and Judge Martinez. The dog's reaction was instant and terrifying. His body went rigid, fur standing on end, muscles coiled like steel springs. A deep, savage growl erupted from his throat, eyes locked on Rhodes with pure, unmistakable recognition. Judge Martinez's gavel slammed down with explosive force. "This court will take an immediate recess. 15 minutes." Before the horror that stole her voice, Sophie Parker was unstoppable sunshine. At 6 years old, she filled rooms with endless stories and questions that tumbled out faster than anyone could answer. Her wild brown curls bounced as she skipped everywhere instead of walking. She loved finger painting, catching fireflies, and the special Saturday pancakes her father made in animal shapes. She'd never experienced real fear until that Wednesday afternoon. It had been a perfect spring day, birds singing, flowers blooming, warm sunshine bathing the backyard in golden light. Jessica Parker watched her daughter through the kitchen window, smiling as Sophie arranged her stuffed animals for an outdoor tea party, complete with plastic cups and imaginary cake. Jessica's phone rang, her mother calling with urgent news about her father's health. She stepped into the pantry for what should have been a quick conversation. 3 minutes. That's all it took. When she returned, the gate hung open. Cold terror flooded her veins, her lungs refusing to work. Sophie was still there, but not alone. A dark blue van idled at the curb, back doors partially open. A man crouched beside her daughter, his smile friendly and practiced. "I have the most amazing magic set in my van," he was saying, voice smooth as silk. "It can make real rabbits appear. Would you like to see how it works?" Jessica's world compressed to a single point of pure maternal rage. "Sophie!" she screamed. The man's head snapped up. His smile vanished, replaced by something inhuman and calculating. He grabbed Sophie's wrist in one violent motion. Sophie froze completely. No scream, no struggle. Her eyes widened with a primal terror no child should ever know. From next door, Daniel Reyes, an off-duty firefighter mowing his lawn, witnessed everything. "Hey! Oh!" he bellowed, already sprinting across his yard. "Get away from her!" The man hesitated for a critical half-second. Sophie wrenched free and ran blindly toward her mother. Jessica swept her daughter into her arms as the van's engine roared to life. Tires shrieked against pavement as the vehicle shot away, leaving black skid marks behind. Jessica clutched Sophie against her chest, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. But Sophie didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just buried her face in her mother's neck and shook uncontrollably, like she'd never be warm again. Police arrived in minutes. Detective Zoe Hudson took command of the scene, her sharp eyes missing nothing. 23 years in the Child Crimes Unit had hardened her, but never dulled her determination. "Matches the pattern," Hudson stated flatly, scanning her notes. 6 children approached within 2 miles of here since January, all lured with promises of animals or magic tricks. Her partner, Detective Marcus Washington, knelt in front of Sophie. "Hi there," he said gently. "Can you tell me what the man looked like?" Complete silence. Jessica stroked Sophie's hair, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Baby, you're safe now. Can you tell the nice officer what happened?" Sophie's fingers dug into her mother's shirt with desperate strength. She didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't move. It was as if her voice had been physically cut from her throat. "She hasn't made a sound since I grabbed her," Jessica whispered, panic bleeding into her words. Not one word, not even a cry. Hudson and Washington exchanged knowing glances. "Acute trauma response," Hudson said quietly. "We've seen this before." Washington sighed heavily. "Without her statement, we're working blind. Man, blue van, generic description, not enough." Daniel Reyes stepped forward, still breathless from running. "I got most of the license plate," he stated firmly. KL47. In the days that followed, Sophie vanished into herself more completely with each passing hour. She stopped playing, stopped drawing, refused to leave the house or her mother's sight. She flinched violently at every passing vehicle. Sleep became a battleground, her small body thrashing against invisible threats, mouth open in silent screams that never came, jerking both parents awake night after night. Jessica and Michael Parker tried everything humanly possible. Her favorite stuffed elephant, ice cream for breakfast, Disney movies on endless loop. Nothing worked. The bright, chattering child they knew was disappearing right before their eyes, replaced by a silent shadow. One night, Jessica collapsed into a kitchen chair across from Michael, her face hollow with exhaustion. "The trauma specialist suggested an animal," she said, voice cracking. "A therapy dog with special training." Michael ran his hands through his hair, desperation etched in every line of his face. "You really think that could help?" "I don't know," Jessica admitted, tears finally breaking free. "But I can't watch her disappear anymore. I'll try anything, absolutely anything." Neither could have imagined how that single decision would change everything, not just for Sophie, but for countless others. The air inside Hope Animal Rehabilitation Center felt heavy with antiseptic and the earthy scent of fur. The reception area was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock and the occasional rustle of papers. In a special training room down the hall, Max lay on a padded bed, his watchful eye tracking every movement with calculated precision. Once, Max had been the pride of the K9 unit, a dog whose instincts had saved lives and brought killers to justice. Now he bore the scars of sacrifice. One ear missing, deep wounds along his flank that had never properly healed, permanent reminders of the night that ended his career. 2 years ago, during a raid to rescue a kidnapped child, Max had lunged at an armed suspect without hesitation. The man slashed at him with a hunting knife, cutting deep into his flesh. Even bleeding heavily, Max had held the man until officers secured him. But the injuries were too severe for him to return to active duty. Dr. Amara Wilson had rescued him from euthanasia, convinced his intelligence and loyalty still had purpose. Today would test that belief. Jessica Parker sat nervously in a chair, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. Sophie stood half hidden behind her mother's legs, her eyes fixed on the floor. 32 days had passed since the attack, 32 days of silence. Amara knelt to Sophie's eye level, her voice gentle but not condescending. "Hi, Sophie, I'm Amara. I work with special dogs who help kids who've been through scary things." Sophie didn't respond. Her eyes flickered briefly to the German Shepherd across the room, then back to the floor. "Would you like to meet Max? He used to be a police dog, just like the ones in those picture books. He helped catch bad guys." Sophie remained motionless, but she didn't retreat further behind her mother. That alone was progress. Jessica smoothed her daughter's hair. "He's a very good dog, sweetheart. He helps people feel safe." Amara gave a quiet command. "Stay." Max didn't move a muscle, just watched with intense focus. "You don't have to come close if you don't want to," Amara explained. "Max will wait right here. But if you feel ready, you can put out your hand and he'll come to you." For long moments, nothing happened. Sophie remained frozen in place. Then, inch by painful inch, she emerged from behind her mother. Her tiny hand lifted, trembling visibly in the air between them. Max waited for Amara's signal, then slowly stood. With deliberate care, he approached the child, movements measured and gentle despite his imposing size. The moment his warm breath touched Sophie's palm, something shifted. Her fingers curled slightly, brushing against his coarse fur. Jessica gasped softly, pressing a hand to her mouth. It was the first time Sophie had willingly reached out to anyone or anything since the attack. "That's wonderful, Sophie," Amara said quietly. "Max likes you very much." Sophie's fingers tightened in Max's fur, gripping him as if he were a lifeline in a storm-tossed sea. Over the next weeks, Max and Sophie became inseparable. During therapy sessions, she would sit beside him, her small hands tracing the scars along his side. When nightmares jolted her awake, it was Max's steady presence that calmed her racing heart. Though Sophie still wouldn't speak, small changes appeared. She began drawing again, simple crayon pictures of a girl and a dog standing together against dark, faceless shadows. One afternoon, during their 6th session with Amara, Sophie was watching Max retrieve a training toy. "Good boy," she whispered. The words were so soft that for a moment Jessica thought she'd imagined them. But when she turned, she saw Sophie staring at Max, her lips still parted in surprise, as if she too hadn't expected the sound. Tears filled Jessica's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. "She trusts him," Amara explained quietly. "Sometimes trust is the first step toward finding your voice again." What no one could have predicted was how that trust would lead them somewhere unexpected, to a courtroom where justice would finally be served. 3 months after the attack, Detective Hudson arrived at the Parkers' door with news that sent ice through Jessica's veins. They'd found Victor Rhodes, the man who had tried to take Sophie. DNA evidence linked him to 2 other abduction cases. They needed Sophie to identify him. "She still barely speaks," Jessica protested. "Just a few words to Max. How can she possibly testify?" "She doesn't need to speak," Hudson explained. "Just confirm identification, and the court has approved Max's presence as a therapy animal." Michael's face hardened. "Are you sure it's him?" "Absolutely certain." Hudson's expression was grim. "The evidence is strong, but eyewitness confirmation would seal it. Without Sophie, he might walk." The thought of facing her daughter's attacker made Jessica physically ill. But the thought of him walking free, of other children facing what Sophie had, that was unbearable. "We'll do it," she said finally, "but Max stays with her every second." What they couldn't know was that Max had encountered Victor Rhodes before, long before Sophie, and that recognition would change everything. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as the trial of Victor Rhodes entered its 3rd day. Every seat was filled with journalists, legal observers, and families hanging on each moment of testimony. Rhodes sat beside his attorney, Thomas Bennett, his expression unnervingly calm despite the weight of evidence mounting against him. Sophie Parker sat with her parents, her small fingers clutching Max's leash so tightly her knuckles turned white. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still beside her, his focus never wavering from Rhodes. Prosecutor Vanessa Taylor had built a methodical case. Evidence placed Rhodes at multiple abduction sites. His van contained disturbing items, zip ties, duct tape, children's clothing. But without Sophie's confirmation, reasonable doubt still existed. "The prosecution calls Sophie Parker," Taylor announced. Jessica squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Remember what we practiced, baby. Max will be right with you." Sophie rose shakily, her eyes downcast as she approached the modified witness stand. Max padded silently beside her, his body positioned protectively between the child and Rhodes. Judge Martinez spoke gently. "Sophie, do you see the person who tried to take you that day in the park?" Sophie didn't look up. Long seconds passed. The courtroom held its collective breath. Then, with deliberate slowness, She raised her arm and pointed directly at Victor Rhodes. Bennett immediately objected. Your Honor, this child has been repeatedly shown images of my client. This identification is unreliable. Overruled, Martinez stated firmly. The jury will determine credibility. Taylor continued carefully. Sophie, did this man say anything to you that day? Sophie didn't speak. Instead, her hand made a subtle movement, the same signal she'd made when first entering the courtroom. Max responded instantly, his posture stiffening, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Bennett rose again. Objection! This theatrical display with the animal is prejudicial. But Judge Martinez wasn't listening. She was studying Max with intense focus. The dog had gone completely still, his entire attention locked on Rhodes with what could only be described as recognition. Mr. Rhodes, Martinez asked suddenly, have you encountered this animal before? Rhodes stiffened, his composed facade cracking. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Rhodes remained silent, his fingers clenching into fists. Detective Hudson, watching from the gallery, suddenly straightened. She whispered something to her partner, who immediately left the courtroom. 5 minutes later, he returned with a thick file, handing it to the prosecutor. Taylor requested a brief recess, which Martinez granted. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Your Honor, Taylor began, we've discovered that 2 years ago, during a police raid to rescue a kidnapped child, Max was the K-9 officer who apprehended a suspect. That suspect escaped prosecution due to evidence issues, but has now been confirmed through DNA as Victor Rhodes. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The dog hadn't just been reacting to Sophie's signal, he had recognized Rhodes from a previous encounter. With this new evidence, the case solidified. Hours later, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. Victor Rhodes would spend the rest of his life in prison. As the courtroom emptied, Sophie knelt beside Max, wrapping her arms around his neck. Thank you, she whispered, loud enough for her parents to hear. Tears streamed down Jessica's face as she watched her daughter speak the first full sentence since the attack. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the Parker family. Detective Hudson pushed through the crowd, crouching to Sophie's level. You were very brave today, she said. You and Max helped us catch a very bad man. Sophie looked up, her voice small but clear. Max wasn't scared, so I wasn't scared either. Some bonds are forged in the darkest moments, some heroes walk on 4 legs, and sometimes finding your voice begins with the courage to stand beside those who protect you. If this story touched your heart, hit subscribe and like right now. Have you ever experienced a connection with an animal that helped you through a difficult time? Share your story in the comments below.